The scientific method. What exactly is the scientific method? It is a systematic, categorical, and uniform process by which we can explore the world around us. It emphasizes facts over belief and observation over reason. The scientific method is essentially a form of structured problem solving. There are three basic steps to any problem solving process which you undertake. Now, problem solving may be a conscious or an unconscious phenomenon, but all problem solving will follow these three steps. It will first state the problem, it will propose a solution or solutions, and then select the best option for the problem, be that an explanation or a situation which has to be overcome, or any particular challenge that the mind is dealing with. As an example, if you were to have two tests scheduled for the same day as a student, you would have a problem, and that problem is then what do you do about these two tests? Now there are three different basic solutions. You could study more for one test than another. You could study only for one test, or you could study none and not study at all for any test. Depending upon your particular situation, you would have to select which of the options is the best option for your particular situation. As another example, if you have a younger sibling in a car with you and you get stranded on the road with a flat tire, you have a problem. The problem is, how do you deal with a flat tire and the sibling at the same time? Do you leave the sibling in the car and get out and change the tire? Do you both sit in the car and wait for someone to come to help? Do you force your sibling to push the car? Whatever your particular option that you select as the best one is your answer to the problem. Now, scientific method is just a structured version of problem solving. It is a framework that we use in order to set aside specific means by which to conduct science and problem solving. There are several different components to the scientific method. The first is to observe. We have to observe the universe around us. The second is to question, raise questions about the universe. The third is to research. We look at all of the available information pertaining to our question. The next is to explain, where we will actually propose an explanation or a solution to the question that we raise. We will then experiment, which is a means by which we can test our explanation, and we will evaluate our experiment for its validity and its results, and then make conclusions based upon that. And looking at observation, observation is basically studying the world, the universe around us. Now, everyone studies the world in some form or fashion, but scientists tend to study it more in depth and more consciously than other people. An example of observation, in 1928, Alexander Fleming, the discoverer of penicillin, was conducting a number of experiments with bacteria. He was keeping these bacteria in a series of petri dishes, and his laboratory was relatively unkempt, untidy, if you will. And in the course of his experimentation, he left it sitting around for a while, went off on holiday, and when he came back, he found that one of the petri dishes that he had left lying around had been contaminated with a series of spores from a mold. So he made this observation about his petri dishes, and he found that the mold was in a certain place on the petri dish and none of the bacteria would grow where the mold was. The second step is to question. You would select a part of the universe that you're going to explore and form questions about it. This raises the object of your study in science. The example, the contamination of the staphylococci that Fleming was studying, he wanted to know why the bacteria would not grow, why they died, and whether or not this worked on all bacteria or just on staphylococci. The next step is to research. Research is exploring the system in question. You're actually going to look at as much information as possible pertaining to your system. In the Fleming case, he researched penicillium, which was the mold which had infected his petri dishes. He exposed various types of bacteria to this penicillium and noted that all of them experienced inhibition or lack of growth from this mold. The next step is to explain. You'll generally form what we call a hypothesis, which is an evaluated explanation. Fleming's hypothesis was that the penicillium mold was making some sort of chemical that inhibited the growth of bacteria. He called this mold juice. The hypothesis that we propose during our explanation stage is a reasonable explanation or solution to the question which we have raised. It must be testable, which means we must be able to form some sort of test in order to try to prove its validity. It must be falsifiable, which means it must be able to be proven wrong, which is the reason why science and religion is not a science. It does not invalidate religion necessarily, but it's not science because it can't be falsified one way or the other. Now the next stage after your explanation is to form an experiment. An experiment is done to test the explanation. We design some sort of method to explore the explanation which we have proposed in the form of our hypothesis. The experiment should be repeatable, which means that we should be able to conduct it more than once and ideally get the same results out of it. What we're essentially doing by forming an experiment is to set up a controlled observation, where we're observing a specific thing and limiting the influence of other factors on the process that we're exploring. For the penicillin example, what Fleming did was to isolate what he called mold juice. He grew the penicillium mold and then extracted it in a solution. After extracting it, he filtered out all of the mold spores, leaving behind the chemical, in theory, what he presumed was the chemical, behind in the solution without any of the mold itself. He then applied the residual solution to his bacteria cultures to see what happened. The next stage is to evaluate. Evaluate means that we then look at the results of our experiment and decide what they mean. We have to assess the results and either validate or disprove the hypothesis that we raised. Is the hypothesis valid? Is it not valid? And if it is invalid, then we have to proceed from there. If it's valid, then we also will proceed in a different direction. If we have a hypothesis which is invalidated by the results of our experiment, we will revise it, come up with a new explanation, and proceed through the process again from the point which we started the hypothesis. For the penicillin experiment or the process that we were discussing, the discovery of penicillin was the evaluation of his experiment. He found that the mold extract killed the bacteria in the same way that the mold did. This led him to conclude that his belief that the mold was producing some sort of chemical that inhibited the bacteria's growth was correct. So the chemical was what was actually active, not the mold itself. And what this did then was to confirm the hypothesis that Fleming had raised. The last step is to draw conclusions. Conclusions will summarize the results of our scientific process and decide what they mean in greater scope of the universe around us. The hypothesis was validated or not is the first step. If it is validated, then we move on forward. If it is invalidated, then we move back and have to revise it. Over time, information can be collected and categorized into a larger body of information. A theory is one example of this, and a theory is an explanation. It's essentially a hypothesis or a series of hypotheses which have been validated to a degree by experimental evidence. A law, on the other hand, is the other component of summarizing information, and all the law does is a collection of observations. It doesn't explain, it just tells us what is going on. So the sequence of investigation then, from start to finish, is first to observe the world around us, and then next to pose a question pertaining to the observations which we have made. We will then research the question, try to find out as much information as we can about it, and from there draw an explanation, some sort of explanation, hypothesis that will give us a solution to the question that we raised. From there we form an experiment by which we can test our hypothesis, and we will then conduct the experiment to try to look at the observations in the experiment and deduce whether the hypothesis is correct or not. After conducting the experiment, we will evaluate it. Is the hypothesis refuted or is it not? If it is refuted, then we have to return back to revise our hypothesis and experiment again. If it is not refuted, then we can draw conclusions, either in the form of eventually forming a theory over time or forming a law over time, depending upon which direction we're going, whether we're looking at explanations or looking at summarizations of processes. Now, a theory in detail is just a hypothesis or a series of hypotheses that are supported by evidence. They must be testable and falsifiable just like a hypothesis, but more importantly, they must make predictions about future systems. A law will summarize observations. It is also supported by evidence like a theory, and is testable and falsifiable, but it makes predictions about future systems as well, but it does not explain, it simply summarizes. An example of a law is what we call the law of conservation of matter. This was developed by Antoine Lavoisier, who was a French chemist in the 18th century, and his law of conservation of matter stated that in a chemical reaction, the amount of matter which exists is constant throughout the reaction, that the matter is neither gained nor lost in the course of a chemical reaction. Now, the law does not explain why that occurs, it simply states that it does. So if we look at the conservation of matter, then any chemical reaction we run should obey the law of conservation of matter. So if I run a reaction by burning something like butane, or run a reaction by burning something like methane, both of those reactions should have the same result in terms of conservation of matter. Now, what are the differences between a hypothesis and a theory and a law? A hypothesis and a theory both will explain, but a law will actually just state observations. A hypothesis is unsupported by evidence, while a theory and a law are both supported by evidence. A theory and a law both must make predictions about other systems, while a hypothesis does not have to. A hypothesis need only concern itself with the particular system that is being studied. Now, a newer component of science, the way that we conduct it, is the formation of what are called models. And models are used to explain. They're more of a crude form of the scientific method. They're not necessarily as structured as the scientific method. But the formation of models allows us to look at explanations and sometimes even raise questions that we wouldn't have otherwise been aware of. They're essentially simplifications of reality. For example, a molecule can be formed as a model. If I look at a molecule in model form, there are ways that this can be done. It can be done on a computer generating an example of the model. We can build a model out of ball and stick components in a model kit. And while a real molecule will not look like the models that we build, the model will give us a good idea of some of the properties of the molecule. It won't tell us everything, but it will give us a lot of ideas, and it's much easier to comprehend than the mathematical descriptions, which are more realistic. A lot of science now is moving to model-based research. This is why things like the International Panel for Climate Change is using models for conducting the science that they do. They're building a series of computer tests in order to explore things. Theoretical physics is also building a series of computer tests. And a lot of the models that are built off of these lead eventually to real research. For instance, the discovery of the Higgs boson particle, or near discovery of it, back in 2013. Now, a model cannot be proven or disproven, but it does form an explanation a lot faster than standard theories do. A good component of the scientific method overall is the fact that it enables us to sort of categorize and summarize information overall. It allows us to store information and to use it and build upon it in the future. And models are ways of being able to do this more effectively in terms of rapidly conducting science.